This aircraft was supposed to die a nameless failure, a footnote in the archive of bankrupt pre-war American aircraft manufacturers, one nobody would even bother to remember. But what happened next, nobody saw coming. Not the military experts, not the competitors, not even the engineers who built this machine on the ruins of two tenders lost back to back. Today you're going to find out how a design dismissed twice as second-rate became the weapon behind one of the boldest, most legend-shrouded strikes in the history of the war, a strike launched off a ship's deck from a place where, by every law of physics, getting airborne should have been impossible. You'll hear how crews parachuted into pitch-black night over enemy territory, how the very same aircraft, in the very same year, saved wounded soldiers and killed its own test pilots, how it was pulled from service in disgrace on one front and crowned an undisputed king on another. There's a disaster here that military command would rather have buried forever. There's a production number that turns the official history of the pre-war tenders completely on its head. And there's an answer to a question that still keeps aviation historians up at night. Was this victory earned, or was it pure chance born of a world war? Stay until the end, because the ending of this story will surprise even those absolutely certain they already know everything about World War II combat aviation. The late 1930s. The United States is racing to rebuild its military aviation, and one corporation keeps getting left behind. North American Aviation, a name that, by the end of the decade, starts to sound almost like a verdict. The company enters every major pre-war competition run by the War Department and loses every single time. The prototypes rolling out of its workshops keep coming out weaker than the production machines of the industry's recognized leaders. What is actually wrong with North American? Engineering weakness? Management failure, or just plain bad luck that follows the company year after year? The answer keeps arriving in the same form. Somebody else wins. In the latest War Department competition, this time for a light attack bomber, the panel turns away from North American once again. The winning prototype belongs to Douglas, the aircraft that will go down in aviation history as the A-20 Boston takes a clean, undisputed victory. Douglas gets the contract. Douglas gets the reputation. Douglas gets the future. North American gets another loss, one more in a decade already full of them. For a company standing on the edge of bankruptcy, this is not a minor sporting defeat. It is a direct blow against the survival of the business itself. Every failed competition means lost orders, lost War Department funding, one less chance to survive in an industry where only winners get to keep operating. Aircraft manufacturing at the end of the 1930s has no room for runners-up. Either a company lands the contract and lives, or it does not, and it slowly dies in its own workshops, buried under blueprints that never made it into metal. And yet there is one detail in this story that looks strange at first glance, if not outright irrational. North American does not throw away the design work it produced for the competition it just lost. A company with no spare cash, no new orders, and seemingly no future stubbornly holds on to the blueprints of a failed project. Why keep the archive of an aircraft that will never be built? Why waste already scarce resources on documentation for a design the War Department has officially rejected? For one simple, brutally practical reason. Bankruptcy does not leave room for sentiment, and it does not leave room for choice either. Every dollar of engineering labor already spent has to pay off somewhere, sometime, or it is gone for good. Throwing the work away would mean admitting that the money, the time, and the effort of the company's best engineers were wasted completely and permanently. And admitting total defeat is something North American's leadership, standing at the edge of a financial cliff, is apparently still not willing to do. This is where the real story begins, because it will soon become clear that clinging to a rejected project was not the desperate move of a dying company. It was the single correct decision of an entire decade full of failures. North American never had to throw away that design work, for one simple reason. That reason is about to reveal itself. And when it does, the history of military aviation in the Second World War is about to take one of its most unexpected turns. The answer to the War Department's frustrated expectations arrives under a designation that did not exist on paper before: NA-40. The Army Air Corps is seriously concerned about its medium bomber fleet, and North American gets a shot at proposing a solution, drawing on design work it almost threw away only moments earlier. The lead engineers, Lee Atwood and Ray Rice, are handed a task that would take most competitors months. North American does not have months. It has a tight deadline and one last chance to prove it is capable of more than another second-place finish. And they deliver. The machine rolled out of the workshop turns out to be remarkably advanced for its time, so advanced that some of its solutions will still be in use in aircraft design decades later. A wide all-metal fuselage with stressed skin that carries part of the structural load itself rather than simply covering a frame, is topped by a twin-tail arrangement. The choice is not accidental. Two smaller tail fins instead of one large one give the rear gunner a better field of view and improve stability if one of the two engines fails. The wing is a story of its own. Mounted in a mid-position on the fuselage, it carries a laminar flow profile with an unusual thickening toward the trailing edge. Why thicken the trailing edge of a wing when decades of engineering logic demanded the opposite? Because that unconventional choice is meant to significantly reduce landing speed and stall speed. It sounds like a detail for specialists only. In practice, it is a decision that will, years later, save the lives of hundreds of inexperienced pilots taking the controls of a twin-engine combat aircraft for the first time in the middle of a war, when there is no longer time for full flight training. 12 tons of takeoff weight places the new aircraft among the heaviest production machines of its class at that moment. The power plant consists of two Wright Cyclone engines producing 1,500 horsepower each, a combined 3,000 horsepower driving two variable pitch propellers. Variable pitch here is not a luxury but a flat necessity. It lets the crew select the optimal blade angle for whatever flight regime is at hand, from climbing out to cruising, squeezing maximum efficiency out of the engines at every stage of a mission. A bomb load of 1 ton is modest by the standards of the 4-engine strategic giants that come later, but more than enough for a machine conceived as a medium frontline bomber, not a tool for strategic carpet bombing of enemy cities. Every element of the design serves one idea: build a combat aircraft equally at home on the paved runway of a major airbase and on a rutted dirt strip 1,000 kilometers from the nearest factory. North American's engineers seem to have understood something military pilots would only fully grasp years later. An aircraft is not built for a test range. It is built for the hands of an ordinary pilot, one who might tomorrow be a fresh flight school graduate, rushed into the sky ahead of schedule by the brutal demands of war. Every engineering choice, from the wing profile to the twin-tail arrangement, serves the same goal: making a complex combat machine forgiving of an inexperienced crew's mistakes. How well that philosophy holds up is tested in the next stage of this project's story. The military hears out every proposal and once again picks the competitor. The War Department's final verdict carries no sentiment at all. The winner is not North American but Martin, whose prototype will carry the future designation B-26 Marauder. For a company that had just poured every remaining resource into developing a progressive new aircraft, this is not a simple disappointment. It is a second major tender lost in a row, the kind of losing streak that would have ended the story for most aircraft manufacturers of that era. The projected range of the new machine stood at 2,000 kilometers. Projected, not confirmed by flight testing. Why only projected? Because the North American design could very well have stayed on paper forever, never making it past the drawing boards and wind tunnel models. The War Department had no intention of funding a prototype for a company that had just lost its second major competition in a row. Engineering calculations remain just calculations until a signed contract stands behind them, and North American still has no contract. This is where a factor no one in the competition could have predicted enters the picture. War breaks out in Europe. On the 1st of September, 1939, German forces cross the Polish border, and the abstract threat diplomats had been discussing for years turns into a continent-wide military conflict. For millions of people in Europe, this is a tragedy. For one bankrupt aircraft manufacturer in California, cynical as it sounds, this is a lifeline. The government of the United States, anticipating a sharp rise in orders from the warring allies, above all the French and British purchasing commissions scrambling to secure any available combat aircraft from across the ocean, stops holding back subsidies for its own aviation industry. Until recently, the War Department simply did not have enough interesting projects to fund. Now the situation shifts within a matter of weeks. Every extra bomber capable of getting off the ground becomes a strategic asset, not a line item to be cut at the first opportunity. On the 10th of September, 1939, just 9 days after the German invasion of Poland, North American finally receives the funding it has been waiting for. The contract calls for the construction of 184 twin-engine bombers, built in metal from the blueprints of a project that only recently was considered a failed experiment of a dying company. Rarely is the irony of history this obvious. An aircraft twice rejected by the War Department as not good enough for mass production gets a contract not because it suddenly became better than its rivals, but because, somewhere across the ocean, decades of peace had just collapsed. Those 184 machines, designated B-25, will launch one of the most extensive combat careers in the history of Second World War military aviation. But in September of 1939, North American's engineers know nothing of that yet. All they know is one simple fact: there is finally money, there is finally a contract, and there is finally time, not much of it, but enough to carry the project from blueprint to a finished combat aircraft ready to fly over a continent already at war. A year after the contract is signed, in 1940, the new machine finally takes to the air. At the controls are experienced test pilots, Vance Breese and Roy Farren, the first men tasked with checking every engineering calculation on paper against reality. The power-to-weight ratio proves excellent up to an altitude of 5,000 meters, and the handling qualities impress right away. The aircraft can hold altitude on a single working engine, a quality that will save more than one crew who lose an engine under enemy fire in the years ahead. The tricycle landing gear, not the most obvious choice for a bomber of this class at the time, sharply improves the pilot's view on takeoff and landing runs. Large diameter tires let the machine shrug off the rough surface of dirt airstrips, the very kind of field it will operate from throughout the coming war, far from the paved runways of major air bases. Development focused above all on aerodynamic refinement, and in one of the very first test flights, the experimental aircraft reaches a top speed of 510 kilometers per hour. But one number does not make a combat aircraft. Testing is testing, and difficulties surface immediately. In the very first flights, Roy Farren reports a serious problem. The aircraft snakes into a characteristic yawing roll during maneuvers, a behavior engineers will later call Dutch roll. For a fighter, that quirk might be unpleasant but tolerable. For a bomber whose entire job is holding a perfectly steady course on a bomb run, it is a verdict against the whole concept of the machine. What good is the fastest, toughest bomber in the world if it cannot hold a straight line over the target steadily enough for the bombardier to aim properly? Test pilot Frank Cook studies the aircraft's behavior in detail and reaches an unambiguous conclusion. The yawing instability is incompatible with accurate bombing. At first glance, there is no simple fix, because the instability is built into the wing's geometry itself, the very profile that had recently looked like an engineering triumph. North Americans' engineers attacked the problem without delay. They changed the wing's dihedral angle, the outward slope of the wing panels relative to the fuselage, effectively removing the positive dihedral on the outer wing sections. That single decision gives the future B-25 its most recognizable visual feature, the distinctive kink in the wing that will later earn the aircraft its gull-wing silhouette. Starting with the 10th aircraft built, the new wing geometry becomes standard. Earlier machines are retrofitted to the same configuration. The lesson here is simple and unforgiving. Speed and engine power are only half the equation for a combat aircraft. The other half is stability, exactly where the outcome of a combat mission is decided, in the final seconds of a straight run at the target, when the crew can no longer maneuver and can only hold course and trust that the engineers on the ground got the math right. North American solves this test. What that solution is truly worth will only become clear once the aircraft faces real fire, not just the critical eye of a factory test pilot. February 1941. The first production B-25s enter service with regular units of the United States Army Air Corps 10 months before the war becomes a reality for America rather than an abstract topic in newspaper headlines. By the time Japanese aircraft strike Pearl Harbor in December of that same year, around 130 of the new twin-engine machines are already in service, mostly aircraft of the B series, distinguished from the original prototypes by added armor and fuel tank protection. The engineering logic here is transparent. Getting a machine into mass production is one thing. Getting it to survive contact with anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters is quite another. The added armor protects the crew from fragments and rifle-caliber rounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks, a rubber lining that partially closes a puncture on impact and keeps fuel from igniting immediately, turn a hit on the tank from a fatal incident into a manageable problem the crew can still nurse back to their airfield. The defensive armament changes substantially. A pair of rifle-caliber machine guns, weapons military engineers privately dismissed as barely worth the name, are replaced by twin, heavy-caliber Bendix turrets mounted above and below the fuselage. Each turret carries 2 guns of 12.7 millimeter caliber, weapons genuinely capable of stopping an attacking fighter rather than merely scaring its pilot off with tracer fire from a safe distance. The upper Bendix turret proves a solid solution and stays on the aircraft almost unchanged for the rest of its combat career. The lower turret is a different story. To cut drag, it is made retractable into the fuselage, an idea that looked elegant on the drawing board but turned into a serious problem in service. The retraction mechanism regularly jams in the extended position, and the turret's design forces the gunner into a prone position, staring into a periscopic sight between the guns, a posture that leaves many gunners dizzy and nauseated mid-battle. Picture a gunner sick to his stomach from his own weapon at the exact moment an enemy fighter closes in from behind. The military quickly concludes that a weapon physically difficult to use at the moment of real danger is worse than no weapon at all. The retractable lower Bendix turret is hastily dropped from production on later B-25 variants, replaced by simple, reliable guns mounted in fuselage cutouts, far less elegant on paper but reliable in real combat. The story of the lower turret is combat aviation of that era in miniature. An engineering solution that works beautifully on the drafting table collides with the reality of a cramped cockpit mid-battle, and the winner is not the most advanced idea, but the most reliable one. Military engineers absorb this lesson well beyond the lower turret. It becomes an unspoken rule guiding nearly every future upgrade to this aircraft's armament for the rest of the war. Dropping the lower turret does not mean giving up on defending the rear hemisphere. A simple pair of machine guns in fuselage cutouts, primitive in appearance, has no moving mechanism to jam at the worst moment and requires no acrobatics from a gunner lying on his stomach. That straightforwardness becomes the B-25's biggest advantage over more technologically ambitious but temperamental rival designs. On the 6th of April, 1942, the combat career of the B-25 begins in earnest. The 3rd Bombardment Group, freshly re-equipped with the new type, strikes Japanese positions in New Guinea, an island that will turn into one of the bloodiest arenas of the entire Pacific War within months. For a machine that not long ago was seen as a consolation prize after 2 lost tenders, this is the moment of truth. From now on, it will be judged not by test engineers, but by Japanese anti-aircraft gunners and fighter pilots. The very first combat sorties proved the engineering choices built into the aircraft were right. The twin tail, the wide fuselage, the reliable power plant, none of it exists only on paper anymore. All of it is tested under real enemy fire. The B-25 demonstrates a level of protection and toughness that quickly becomes legendary among crews. One such aircraft, a B-25C nicknamed Patches, later serving with the 321st Bombardment Group, finishes the war having flown more than 300 combat missions and collecting over 400 patched holes from flak and fighters along the way. By the end of its service life, the airframe was so warped by battle damage that straight and level flight required the pilot to hold constant 8 degrees of aileron trim and 6 degrees of rudder trim, the aircraft literally crabbing sideways across the sky, and still it kept flying and coming home. Ground crews come to love the newcomer just as much as the flight crews do. Easy access to key components, engines, hydraulics, wiring, lets mechanics return even badly damaged machines to service in a short time, right on rough field airstrips, far from factory floors and spare parts depots. In a war where the number of flyable aircraft on an airfield can decide the outcome of an entire campaign, this feature of the design turns out to matter every bit as much as speed or firepower. The engineers who built the machine around dirt strips and minimal ground support are proven right long before a single B-25 takes its first combat hit. But combat toughness is not the only quality the B-25 reveals in its first weeks at the front. One bomber from the 3rd Group is handed a mission about as far from the usual work of a strike aircraft as it gets, evacuating wounded American servicemen from the Philippines, where the remnants of the American Army are fighting a desperate defense against advancing Japanese forces. The spacious fuselage, originally designed for a bomb bay and gunner positions, turns out roomy enough to carry as many as 20 wounded infantrymen out in a single run. A war machine built to inflict damage on the enemy ends up saving the lives of its own soldiers, a paradox that in fact reflects the very nature of the Pacific War, where the front line was so fluid and logistics so fractured that any aircraft capable of getting into the air and reaching somewhere automatically became a rescue vehicle whenever the situation demanded it. It is that versatility, not just speed or firepower, that will make the B-25 one of the most indispensable aircraft of the entire Pacific War, long before all of America hears its name after one particular raid. On the 18th of April, 1942, long before dawn, the carrier Hornet steams toward Japan as part of a task force under Vice Admiral William Halsey. On the flight deck sit 16 B-25 bombers, their crews drawn from volunteers of the 17th Bombardment Group. None of these pilots has ever taken off from a carrier deck before. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, leading the operation, has only a few dozen meters of deck to work with, roughly 140 meters to the edge, and must prove that a land-based twin-engine bomber can get airborne where, by all appearances, it simply should not be able to. The plan hinges on one thing: staying hidden until the last possible second. The task force is meant to close to within about 800 kilometers of the Japanese coast before launching the aircraft under cover of surprise. But a Japanese picket boat spots the American ships far earlier than planned, while the force is still roughly 1,200 kilometers from the target. Surprise is now at risk. Halsey and Doolittle have only one option left: launch immediately, 10 hours ahead of schedule and much farther from shore than the original plan allowed, gambling with a fuel margin that was already razor thin for the full route. Between 8:20 and 9:19 in the morning, All 16 aircraft lift off, one after another, from a deck rolling on the swell. Doolittle's own aircraft nearly touches the water right after leaving the deck before he levels it out at the last instant. Not a single accident on takeoff, not a single mistake. The 16 bombers spread out into groups of 2 to 4 aircraft and head for the Japanese coast at wave-top height, skimming just above the swells to avoid detection by radar and lookouts. Around noon Tokyo time, 6 hours after launch, the aircraft arrive over Japan and climb to bombing altitude. 10 targets are struck in Tokyo, 2 in Yokohama, and 1 each in Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Some crews run into scattered anti-aircraft fire over their targets and a handful of Japanese fighters, though none press home a serious attack. Not a single bomber is shot down over Japanese territory, the element of surprise holding up exactly as long as the mission needs it to. But there is a second half to this story, and it is far less triumphant. The plan called for landing at airfields in China once the bombing run was complete. Because of the early launch and the extra distance to the target, the fuel margin, already calculated down to the last drop, burns through faster than the geography of the route allows. 15 of the 16 aircraft run out of fuel in the darkness over Chinese territory and either crash land or have their crews bail out by parachute, never finding a usable airfield in the night. The 16th aircraft, in an even more desperate position, turns north and comes down inside the Soviet Union, where its crew will be interned for the rest of the war under the terms of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. The patriotic weight of the Doolittle Raid for an America that had, by this point, spent nearly 4 straight months absorbing nothing but bad news after Pearl Harbor is hard to overstate. A symbolic strike at the very heart of the Japanese home islands, delivered by a handful of volunteers flying aging land-based bombers off a carrier deck, shifts the tone of the entire Pacific War, not through the weight of the damage it inflicts, but through the psychological jolt that forces Japanese command to rethink homeland defense, pulling fighter units away from other fronts to exactly the place they will end up being needed least. The patriotic impact of the Doolittle Raid turns out to be so powerful that it almost instantly creates a problem of an entirely different kind, a production problem. Orders for the B-25 pour into North American's plant in Inglewood in a flood far exceeding the factory's real manufacturing capacity. The War Department, which not long ago had been stingy with subsidies for a failing company, now demands bombers in numbers nobody would have dared dream of half a year earlier. Determined to meet the War Department's deadlines at any cost, North American's engineers push through a deliberate simplification of the manufacturing process. Every operation on the assembly line gets reviewed with one goal: cut the man-hours needed to build each aircraft without losing structural strength or combat capability. The result impresses even hardened engineers across the industry. North American manages to cut the labor required to build a B-25 by roughly 25% compared to the rival B-26 Marauder, a figure that explains why the factory ends up turning out far more aircraft than its direct competitor from the pre-war tenders. Interest in a machine that has already proven its versatility on land and in the air comes from an entirely different branch of the armed forces as well, the United States Navy. Just 2 months after the Doolittle Raid, the Navy contracts for a share of North American's production capacity, and by February of 1943, it starts receiving the first aircraft of a naval variant designated PBJ. Over time, the Navy and the Marine Corps take delivery of more than 700 of these aircraft, a figure North American's leadership could hardly have imagined back when the company stood on the edge of bankruptcy. The naval variant tackles missions far removed from classic land bombing. A search radar hides inside the nose fairing, capable of detecting surface targets and surfaced submarines at considerable range, well before an observer's unaided eye would ever spot them. The main weapon of the anti-submarine version becomes the depth charge, dropped from low altitude onto the suspected position of an enemy submarine, rather than the high explosive bombs meant for ground targets. The Marine Corps, receiving the PBJ in place of the single-engine aircraft its crews are used to, faces a genuine retraining challenge. Crews who previously knew only fighters and light attack aircraft now have to master a multi-crew twin-engine bomber running on an entirely different combat logic, one demanding a coordinated team rather than a single pilot used to relying only on himself. Even so, by 1944, Marine PBJ squadrons are flying combat missions in the Solomon Islands and over Rabaul, regions where Japanese naval aviation had recently held sway and where a land-based bomber in Marine service would have sounded absurd not long before. So one aircraft, originally designed as a medium frontline bomber for a land-based air force, turns in less than 3 years into a universal platform for 3 branches of the armed forces at once: the Army Air Forces, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, each finding its own use for the machine, far beyond the original requirement the War Department drew up before the war even began. The same aircraft, the same year, 1942, and 2 completely different fates, depending on which theater of war it happens to be flying over. In the Pacific, the B-25 quickly becomes an indispensable tool in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea campaigns. But the jungle presents the designers with a problem that could never have been foreseen on a drafting board in California. Standard heavy-caliber, high-explosive bombs, built to destroy solid structures, turn out to be nearly useless against enemy positions scattered through dense forest. The answer arrives quickly and practically. The twin-engine bombers increasingly fly missions carrying, in place of a handful of large bombs, cassettes packed with hundreds of small fragmentation bombs weighing around 10 kilograms each, weapons designed specifically to hit troops in the open without needing a precise hit on a single target. Dropped drums and canisters of incendiary mixture serve the same purpose, burning away vegetation along with whatever enemy is hiding in it. By the end of 1942, the C and D variants enter production, differing from each other mainly by assembly location, the plant at Inglewood or the new facility at Kansas City, but sharing uprated engines, larger fuel tanks, and an autopilot as standard equipment. The story of the same aircraft unfolds very differently on the other side of the world. In 1942, several bomb groups are shipped to Egypt to support British forces. The American twin-engine bombers take part in the Second Battle of El Alamein, later supporting Allied landings in Sicily and southern Italy. One might expect the same aircraft that proved itself in the Pacific to perform just as well here. But the conditions of the Mediterranean theater turn out to be entirely different. Here, the aircraft fly mostly in daylight, and that single tactical choice ends up costing them heavily. German and Italian fighter pilots quickly work out the design's weak point. They prefer to attack B-25 formations head-on, from the direction where the bomber's defensive armament is weakest. Field engineering and repair depots respond without delay, developing and shipping out kits to install a pair of additional forward-firing heavy machine guns right in the nose of the fuselage. But fixing one weakness in the design does not solve the problem entirely. On the 22nd of January, 1943, a dozen Royal Air Force bombers attack oil storage facilities on the Belgian coast, near Ghent. Anti-aircraft fire and German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters scrambling to intercept managed to claim several of the aircraft. 2 forward-firing guns prove insufficient against a coordinated defense over a well-protected target. After this failed debut, the Royal Air Force uses the B-25 over the European theater in a very limited way, assigning the aircraft a far humbler, though in its own way important, role. The spacious cockpit and the low-maintenance engines give the aircraft a second chance, this time not in combat, but in training classrooms. The B-25 becomes an ideal training platform for preparing hundreds of young pilots over the foggy airfields of the British Isles, far from anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. The very same machine, designed for a single task, turns out to be a triumph in one set of hands and a disappointment in another, not because the design itself changed, but because war rarely allows one solution to work equally well on every front at once. The tone of the story shifts along with the theater of war. In the fall of 1942, the B-25 appears on the Eastern Front at about the worst possible moment imaginable, in the middle of one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. The Soviet Union receives the aircraft through the Lend-Lease program, and over the course of the war, roughly 860 of these bombers pass through Soviet air units, a number comparable to an entire air army. Pilots who had previously flown the domestic SB and DB-3 bombers greet the aircraft from across the ocean with open interest that quickly turns into professional respect. The outside perspective is especially telling here. Soviet air crews, accustomed to far more modest comfort and equipment in their own bombers, agree almost unanimously on the Mitchell's easy handling and the quality of its radio navigation gear. American engineers, it seems, spent no small amount of time on details that look trivial, right up until a crew spends several hours in the cockpit in freezing cold. A pneumatic de-icing system, a powerful cabin heater, warm air blown across the windshield, and a continuous flow of ethanol onto the propeller blades to prevent ice buildup. This has nothing to do with comfort, of course. It is a matter of basic survival for crew and aircraft alike, in conditions the California engineers never designed the plane for in the first place. At first, Soviet command assigns the new aircraft to frontline aviation, and the European scenario repeats itself in every detail. A large twin-engine bomber, relatively slow by fighter aviation standards, operating right along the front line, takes heavy losses. According to some accounts, on the 8th of October near Rzhev, a group of 6 bombers, having already completed its mission, was intercepted by 4 German Bf-109 fighters. In the air battle that followed, both sides took losses, the Soviet crews flying the American aircraft and the German fighter pilots alike. Soviet command gradually reaches the same conclusion the Americans had already reached in the skies over North Africa. Using an expensive bomber, vulnerable under active fighter opposition, directly along the front line is far from the best way to employ such a machine. The decision comes quickly and without sentiment. The American twin-engine bomber is transferred out of frontline aviation and into long-range bomber units. And it is here, far from the front line, that the aircraft finds its true niche on the Eastern Front. The Mitchell spends years as a mainstay of the long-range bomber regiments of the Soviet Air Force, standing alongside the domestic Il-4, an aircraft of an entirely different design, but with a similar range of combat tasks. One of the aircraft's greatest advantages shows itself precisely here. The spacious fuselage lets crew members move freely inside the aircraft during flight, making it possible to give first aid to the wounded without waiting to return to base. To extend their range on deep missions, Mitchell crews often carry additional fuel tanks right inside the bomb bay, moving the entire bomb load onto external hardpoints beneath the wings instead. The story repeats itself almost word for word. The same aircraft that failed in a frontline role over North Africa and near Rzhev finds recognition and long service exactly where it is not asked to punch through dense defenses along the front, but simply to fly far to a target and make it home again. Different theaters of war demand different things, and the very same aircraft proves again and again that its true strength lies precisely in that versatility, not in being superior under every possible condition at once. By the middle of the war, with the B-25 already tested in combat on 3 continents, North Americans' engineers land on an obvious idea. If the basic design is good enough to survive the jungle, the desert, and a Russian winter alike, what if the aircraft were given genuinely powerful engines and turned into something more than just a reliable workhorse? North Americans' designers had actually run the numbers on this possibility back at the drawing board stage, but a severe wartime shortage of R-2800 engines blocked the plan at the time, since everything coming off engine assembly lines went straight to higher priority programs. By 1944, the shortage is behind them. Engine output finally catches up with the demands of the war industry. North American rushes into a modified variant, fitting two R-2800 engines in place of the standard power plant. The experimental aircraft, given the in-house designation NA-98X, takes to the air and immediately shows an impressive thrust-to-weight ratio along with noticeably improved handling. On a straight run, the aircraft easily reaches 570 kilometers per hour, a figure that would have placed the upgraded Mitchell among the fastest twin-engine combat aircraft of its day. The promising test program breaks off in tragedy. During a demonstration flight, pulling up sharply out of a dive at extremely low altitude, the prototype cannot withstand the increased aerodynamic loads and loses both wing panels in mid-air. The test pilot does not survive. The cause turns out to be painfully straightforward for the engineers. The increased engine power and the noticeably improved handling let the pilot inadvertently exceed the structural limits of an airframe originally designed around far more modest power plants, and the wing structure simply had not been reinforced in time for the new loads. Work on this direction is halted immediately, but the failure of one experiment rarely closes off an engineering search. More often, it simply redirects it. With the push for more speed and power running straight into the airframe's structural limits, the engineers' efforts shift toward a completely different task, adapting an aircraft already proven in combat to a strafing role. If the American Air Forces are already short on classic bombers, and low-altitude B-25 raids on fortified enemy positions do not, in the judgment of command, give the crew enough protection against dense anti-aircraft defenses, then the logic points to an obvious solution. Since machine gun and cannon fire proves more effective than level bombing against scattered small targets, the bomber needs to become a flying battery of rapid-fire weapons instead. That chain of reasoning is exactly what gives rise to the B-25G modification, a project that fundamentally reworks the nose section of the airframe and turns the bomber into a genuine hunter of small ground and maritime targets. What began as a chase for record speed ends up producing a completely different, but no less radical, transformation of the aircraft, one that will change the B-25's combat role beyond recognition. The first B-25G strafers arrive in the Pacific Theater full of promise for their new combat role. The nose section, stripped of its familiar glazed bombardier's compartment, now carries a 75mm cannon and a pair of fixed heavy machine guns, with many aircraft adding another pair of guns in side-mounted package installations. The standard strafing tactic is simple: a shallow dive from about 300 meters, a short burst, and a turn away for another pass. The reality of combat quickly sorts things out. In a single pass, the pilot manages no more than 3 shots from the cannon before the target slips out of the sight, since a manually loaded gun is simply not built for rapid fire. Airframes shake during firing, and a cloud of gun smoke blocking the sight only drag accuracy down further. Add to that a plain shortage of worthwhile targets for the Japanese across most of the Pacific Theater, and the picture becomes clear. In the vast majority of combat sorties, pilots of the newly minted strafers prefer to rely on machine guns alone, leaving the bulky cannon sitting idle in the nose. This heavy, underperforming weapon is dropped for good as soon as the assembly line at the new Kansas City plant starts turning out the most produced variant of the whole family, the B-25J. The aircraft gets its familiar bombardier's position and glazed nose fairing back, though there is still room in it for a pair of heavy Colt Browning machine guns, with additional forward-firing guns added along the sides for strafing runs. The crew of this version numbers 6, a balanced mix of firepower, bomb load, and versatility that draws on the best lessons from every experiment run on the basic design before it. Over 4 years of continuous production, nearly 10,000 aircraft roll off the line, 9,817 twin-engine North American aircraft to be exact. And in that number lies the full irony of the story that opened this account. By production volume, the Mitchell far outstrips both of its recent rivals from the pre-war tenders, the Martin B-26 Marauder, built in a run of just over 5,000 aircraft, and the Douglas A-20 Boston, whose production run fell short of even 8,000 units. The aircraft once regarded as the undisputed winners of the late 1930s competitions end up producing far fewer machines than the aircraft twice dismissed as a second-rate consolation prize. The B-25. Mitchell earns its place in history entirely on its own merits, and its story stands as valuable proof of one simple truth: toughness, ease of handling, and simplicity of maintenance in real field conditions matter far more to the fate of a combat aircraft than dry performance figures on a design bureau's paper. Luck certainly played its part in this story, but the genuine attachment of the thousands of people who took the controls of this aircraft across 3 continents and 3 branches of the armed forces is the strongest proof that North Americans' engineers got something right once and for all. But there's a question this story seems to leave open on purpose. 2 tenders lost back-to-back is just an ordinary business failure for one company. The 1st of September, 1939, is a catastrophe on a global scale. Did coincidence save North American, or would the engineering logic have forced its way through eventually anyway, without a single shot fired, without Hitler, without a single city destroyed? What do you think? A deserved win for the better design, or pure chance born of a world war? Write your version in the comments. Hit like if you want more investigations that go all the way to the bottom of a story. Subscribe and hit the bell to be first in line when we open the next folder in the archive of uncomfortable facts.